Let's start with the end point. Is that realistic? Is it realistic to expect that China will do that?
I think it's very hard to say. I mean, the administration's never been particularly clear about what exactly it means for China to comply with their demands. What kinds of intellectual property protection do they need? What kinds of capacity for U.S. firms to enter and compete without joint partnerships, things like that? That's been left a little bit vague. So I don't know where the line is. Presumably in the negotiations, the Chinese will understand where the line is. And that's one very important question. But another important question, I think, is what would it take for the president to get rid of the tariffs entirely? Remember, the initial sell for this policy was we'll use the tariffs to get them to comply and get better trade agreements. And then they go away. They're used as a strategic tool. They've never really said under what circumstances the China tariffs would go away.
And what are the effects, as best you can reckon right now, of those tariffs? I mean, you're a renowned economist. And some people say, you know what, if you look at the total amount of global trade, it's not that big a deal.
I think if you look at the tariffs that have been put in place, the steel and aluminum tariffs, not a big consequence. The China tariffs so far, which are relatively low on the bulk of the imports, they've had an impact. You've seen it in consumer prices. You've seen it in some of the industrial goods. But they haven't slowed global trade dramatically. I think the real concern would be go all in on every Chinese import, do it at a 25% rate. That's a $25 billion tax increase. Ramps up to 50. That'd be noticeable and would hurt the president's economic agenda. So avoiding that kind of self-inflicted wound, I think, is a key question. What would it take to do that?
Let's talk about something else that's pending up in Congress right now, and that is funding the government. I mean, you've been through this quite a few times, all the threats of shutting down the government. It's back up again, involves, among other things, the wall down there. What are the odds that, in fact, that we really will shut down the government in this lame duck session?
Well, I think the first thing to emphasize is that the Congress funded most of the federal government for the full year before it left for the elections. And so what's left is a few agencies, DHS in particular, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, some ones associated with the immigration issues. And in many cases, those personnel are deemed essential. So even if you shut it, they'll still go to work. So what's at stake in terms of the operation of the government is relatively little. What's at stake for the president is getting the wall funded, a political victory prior to the Democrats taking control of the House of Representatives. That makes me think there's a really serious chance this could happen because it's his last chance with Republicans controlling both houses. Well,
that's a really powerful point, Doug, because if that analysis is right, I'm sure it is, then what that suggests is it's a relatively inexpensive way for the president to make a really big splash on an issue that really is important to his base.
I think that's exactly right. And I think this is best viewed not as a governance issue, but as really a politics issue. And one thing the president has been very good about is ticking off campaign promises that he has made and trying to make sure he's fulfilled them. The wall is part of that list, and he's unhappy that it's not been funded so far.
So let's also talk about the Federal Reserve, because that's very much in the news this week. As you know, we had Rich Clara to talk today. We're going to have Jay Powell tomorrow. We've got minutes coming on Thursday.
Right.
There are a lot of people in the markets, which doesn't mean they're informed, but people in the markets are speculating they may change their course. They might actually have a pause in 2019. The president has come out and been very explicit, saying it's low inflation. Are you listening, Fed? Keep your rates down. What do you make of that dynamic? Is the president right?
I don't think the president should be tweeting and making the case against what the Fed's doing. He's allowed his opinion, of course. There are ways to convey that opinion to Fed policymakers. I don't think it helps the credibility of the Fed to have the president conducting himself this way. If you go back to the substance of the argument, I think what the Fed would say is, look, December 2018, that increase is in the lockbox. That's not going to change. But we've always been data dependent. We've always been willing to change the rate at which we normalize in 2019. And there have been some indicators that have come in weak. Not just the market, which many people focus on, but the underlying real economy. housing permits are blinking bright red, and the housing market is soft. That's something that I think the Fed's worried about. That's an interest rate sensitive sector of the economy. So they're going to take a close look, and they may in fact back off. I don't think that would be a crazy idea.
Would it help the markets? Would it help all of us if the Fed were a little bit more explicit about which data that they're dependent on? We had Dan Tarullo on, the former governor of the Federal Reserve, earlier today, and he said, look, it's not a question of whether you're data dependent. You need a narrative. Janet Yellen, when she was there, was very explicit, for example, about I'm looking at the labor markets particularly. Is there excess capacity still to absorb into the labor markets? But we're not getting as clear a sense from this Fed. Do you think this Fed is doing as good a job as its predecessors in communicating to us about what the narrative is and what they're looking at?
Well, I think that always depends on the chair. Jay Powell is developing his narrative. I don't think it's crystal clear to markets yet because he's still relatively new in the job. If you think about it, though, even just saying we're going to focus on the labor market, there's excess capacity, I think most people would have thought that suggested the unemployment rate get down to something like 4.5%. It's well below that. So even if you know the right indicator, it's hard to identify the stopping point. And I think that's what they're going through right now. Inflation hasn't picked up the way they've expected in some cases, so you're looking at that, but what's the right stopping point? It's a tough thing to convey. And I think they've been hurt, quite frankly, by a comparable difficulty over on the trade side, where the market's looking at these trade negotiations, doesn't know what the end point is, doesn't know what data would suggest success, what the Chinese do would cause the tariffs to go away, and so has to react to news in a very uncertain fashion.